That very generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here today. So now I'm kind of previewed what I'm going to talk about today when he mentioned that I have a book under review. And so I'm going to give you some snippets from that book. It is basically a fairly short text. It's one of the Cambridge Elements books, which are supposed to be nice compilations, useful for teaching. So I'm hopeful that it's going to come out later this year. Hope it might be useful for folks who are teaching in this area. But basically it's a book assessing sustainable development in Southeast Asia with a particular focus on what are the environment-focused sustainable development goals. So I will be talking today about those three goals in particular. And as Nam said, I sort of toggle between being really interested in household level decision making around the environment, but also the global policies and processes that influence that decision making. So my talk today is really going to be about global policies. So I'm not going to talk as much about some of my on the ground work, but it definitely informs how I'm thinking about policy. And the SDGs are one of the big overarching approaches to policy that are really influencing folks at different scales. So I'm going to take that as the lens by which I'm going to structure my speech or my talk today. So I think Southeast Asia presents this really interesting conundrum. You can see there's this sort of picture in the background. This is sand mining just outside Mandalay in Burma. And right behind it you have this gorgeous pagoda. So this is a sort of classic dilemma in Southeast Asia. You have these rich cultures, so many interlinkages between culture and nature, and yet so many pressures to develop the environment. And Southeast Asia in particular is often pointed to as a success story around poverty reduction in particular. And so particularly in Southeast Asia, the rates of poverty have dropped pretty significantly over the last 3 decades. So from around about half the population of Southeast Asia living below the poverty line in 1990 to less than 10% now, although it's fluctuated a little bit with COVID, so it's going back up in a couple of places. And you can see that the poverty rates, outside Burma, which remain high, reflective of a lot of political conflict there, other countries have done a pretty good job in reducing their poverty rates. These are all based on national poverty lines, though, which are relative poverty rates. It's not an absolute poverty rate, so bear that in mind. But the success of poverty reduction, I would argue, has come at the cost of the environment. And we see that pretty clearly with some of the statistics I'm going to show you about where we're at on the environmental sustainability, sustainable development goals. So a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have basically predicated their development on natural resource expropriation. So we can think of wetlands and peatlands and forests that have been converted into palm oil in Indonesia. We can think about rich stands of forests that have been reduced to timber and paper mill chips in Vietnam and other parts of mainland Southeast Asia, and oceans and rivers that have been trawled for fish. Factories producing everything from electronics to textiles are producing plastic waste and carbon emissions, and all sorts of localized problems as well. And as a region, Southeast Asia stands out in a couple of really negative trends that are worrisome. Has some of the highest rates of deforestation in the globe, higher than the Amazon. Some of the highest rates of phosphorus use, so additional fertilizer use for agriculture, and the highest rates of premature death from air pollution in the world. So those are not measures that we like to see for Southeast Asia, but they continue. And just this past week, if anybody knew anyone tried to get into Vietnam, the airport in Hanoi, Noi Bai Airport, was closed because the particulate pollution combined with thermal conversion, because Hanoi is in kind of a bowl surrounded by mountains, airplane could not land for more than a day. And so they had to be diverted to other airports. So this is not only an environmental problem, this is a social problem, it's an economic problem, and it's one that Southeast Asia is increasingly not able to avoid anymore. And so what I want to talk about today in the time I have is how can we characterize these sustainable development challenges, particularly for Southeast Asia, What does Southeast Asia tell us about how we might achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? And could there be some better pathways than what Southeast Asia is currently on? And I don't think it'll be any surprise. I think there are better pathways, and so I'll try to present some of those towards the end of my talk. But just to sort of familiarize everybody with the Sustainable Development Goals, if you haven't been following it closely, there's 17 key goals that were agreed to globally in 2015, and they seek to align protection of the environment with improved living standards. They have this very explicit focus on integration. And a lot of people have argued that in fact the environment Sustainable Development Goals underpin all the rest of them. And so this is what you see in this figure here that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is if we don't have a biosphere, it's going to be impossible for us to have societal development. It's going to be impossible for us to have economic growth. That without a biosphere, without forests and water and oceans, and taking care of climate pollution, we're not able to achieve all of the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they really underpin all the rest of them. So that's the theory, but I think as I'll show you today, the reality is this, which is the economic goals are the ones that have been prioritized. So Southeast Asia in particular has focused more on economic growth, on development of economies, on development of infrastructure, and on employment. And those have come at the cost of a shrinking biosphere, which is actually at the top. And so we need to kind of figure out what can we do to turn this back so that the biosphere Sustainable Development Goals underpin the others and are treated in a much more integrative fashion. So there's a lot going on in Southeast Asia. The good news is countries are paying attention to the SDGs. Countries are promoting their rankings in the SDGs. Here's Thailand, we're #1. There's lots of workshops that are going on about sustainable development throughout Southeast Asia. There's tons of reports. Lots of the development agencies issue these regular reports on how we're doing on some of these SDGs. But it's a really partial picture. We don't have as clear a sense of how the SDGs are working together. And we don't have as clear a sense of how some achievements, particularly on the economic goals, are coming at the cost of the other ones, the environmental ones, as I've said. Particularly because a lot of our indicators of environmental trends in Southeast Asia continue to be negative. So let me give you a sense of a couple of current sort of state of affairs in terms of indicators. So this is focused on well-being as measured by the Human Development Index, which is an index of indicators put together by the United Nations Development Program. They do this for the whole world. I've just pulled the Southeast Asian ones. What they try to do is, as an index, they aggregate economic goals together with well-being ones. So for the HDI, if you're familiar with it, it relates to income, it relates to education, and it relates to health. So it's an attempt to be a little bit more holistic than just thinking about economic growth alone. And it is measured as an index from 0 to 1. So the closer you get to 1, the higher your well-being is seen. So you can see for Southeast Asia, not a surprise, Singapore and Brunei, fairly close to 1, very high on the Human Development Index. That's because they have higher levels of income, and as a result, they have been able to invest in higher levels of education and higher levels of longevity in particular, so long lifespans. Then you see the middle income countries of Southeast Asia kind of clustered in green there. Countries doing fairly well on indicators of well-being, but not quite as high as Singapore and Brunei. And then you've got the countries that are sort of considered the ones that are still lower income, closer to less high levels of Human Development Index, so Laos, East Timor, Cambodia, and Myanmar in red. Okay. So that's where we are in terms of sort of general well-being. But how are these countries doing on the specific sustainable development goals? So let's get a snapshot of that as well. So this is an aggregate done by SCOP, which is the UN Commission for Asia and Pacific. So it includes other countries besides just Southeast Asia. But all 17 sustainable development goals are listed, and then the target, we're supposed to achieve all these sustainable development goals by 2030. You know, it's now 2024, we're getting pretty close. And so as of 2023, essentially none had been met. So it tells you we're off track. We're not gonna meet them for 2030. But it also gives you a sense of the ones we're doing a little bit better on. And so, as I said, no poverty is the one that at the top that we're doing better on in Asia generally and in Southeast Asia specifically. Doing better on an economic goal, the industry one, development of industry and jobs and infrastructure. Doing okay on reducing some of the inequalities, doing okay on health, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, could be better, but could be worse. But it's really the environmental goals that are worrisome here. So you can see climate action, goal 13, we are backtracking. We are actually worse off than we were when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015. Life below water, management of our oceans, we barely budged. And life on land, doing poorly, and I would argue actually we're doing even more poorly than these indicators suggest, and I'll give you some ideas on why that is. So our environment goals are really falling behind. We're not gonna meet them, and so if we want to make progress, we need to reverse course, we need to think of other things. But I don't wanna just single out Southeast Asia, although it's obviously our topic today. I wanna put Southeast Asia in the context of the rest of the globe so we can see how Southeast Asia is doing compared to others. So you can see again on no poverty, Asia is doing relatively well compared to other regions. So particularly compared to sub-Saharan Africa, which has been particularly hard struck by COVID and the sort of economic pressures of COVID. So sub-Saharan Africa, very unlikely to meet the no poverty goals, but you can see in Southeast Asia, definitely some progress, particularly some countries like Thailand. Vietnam has fallen back a little bit because of COVID, same with Indonesia, and Myanmar has obviously fallen back because of political situations and the coup. But it could be worse, as we can see some of the other regions are also falling behind. So sort of a mixed bag on the poverty goal, but let's go to the climate sustainable development goal. And you can see here that Southeast Asia, again, a mixed bag. I would argue a little bit of false hope here. I'll show you some more detailed statistics. In particular, I would disagree that Cambodia is doing well on the climate action goal, but I'll explain that in a little bit. But it's really the major greenhouse gas emitters that are showing up in red as not achieving their goals because we haven't had enough climate action from them, particularly around financing. That is sending money to other countries to enable them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The curious thing about the Sustainable Development Goal 13 on climate action, it doesn't ask anybody to reduce their emissions, which I would argue is the most important thing that you should ask for when you're doing climate policy. So the Sustainable Development Goal for climate is weak to begin with, and we're already not meeting that. So a lot of the indicators on this goal are around increased financing rather than actual climate mitigation action. So even on those weak indicators, we're not doing as well. Okay. Then on life below water, so this is better management of our oceans, fisheries, and dealing with things like ocean plastic pollution. You can see the world is doing terribly. So it's not just Southeast Asia. Globally, we're really off track. A lot of this has to do with overfishing, too many subsidies for fishing fleets, not managing our ocean ecosystems effectively, and not tackling marine plastic pollution in particular. And then SDG 15, which is the one about terrestrial ecosystems, life on land. Some of the countries that were doing poorly on climate are doing better on this one. It has to do, for a lot of countries, with having set aside protected areas. There's a goal to have set aside about 30% of the land area in some sort of form of conservation. Here in the United States, we need it pretty easily because we have a lot of federal lands, national parks, Bureau of Land Management lands, and so forth. You can see Southeast Asia, though, stands out as the really weak spot, along with Brazil, on this goal, in particular because of those high rates of deforestation that I mentioned before. So we're in this quandary. We have these goals, we're not meeting them. We are basically trading off, meeting some of the economic goals for a lack of progress on many of the environmental goals. And we can see this actually visually. We can see what is happening if we look at plots of that Human Development Index I showed you a little bit earlier against the ecological footprint of different countries. That is, how many resources are they consuming? It's a measure of deforestation, fish, how much food we're producing, how much carbon pollution we're generating, how much plastic pollution we're generating. So material footprint sort of aggregates all of those impacts together. So you can see on the y-axis, here's the material footprint per capita. And you can see on the x-axis, this is the Human Development Index. So again, 1 is high human development, 0 is low human development. So essentially, in an ideal world, in a sustainably developed world, we would be here. We would be in this green box. So we would have high levels of well-being, and we would also have low levels of environmental impact. But of course, nobody's here. No country in the world has been able to achieve this sort of dream of sustainable development. Here's where most of the Southeast Asian countries cluster, in the red box. So making progress, as I said, in a lot of the human development measures, but their material footprints are growing. So they're following this linear trajectory. You can see Singapore is way up here as significant on high capita per consumption and footprint, but also high HDI. So this is where we don't want to go, but this is where that box is potentially moving towards. What we want is everybody to be moving down here. And you can see here's the US, right? And we want to be down here, but we also are not achieving that. So a different way to think about the Human Development Index that tries to account for those costs to the environment is a new thing that the UNDP has started trying to do. Just in the last couple of years. I don't know if anybody's been following this. They are taking the traditional Human Development Index figures and they're adjusting them for planetary impact. That is, you may have high HDI, but if it comes as a result of a really intense material footprint, we're going to drop you down. We're going to indicate that relationship in this adjusted HDI. So here's Southeast Asia as it's been adjusted. So let me explain this diagram to you. Okay, so here's our countries that we had before. Here's the traditional Human Development Index that we saw before. Here is an adjustment. So this is taking the HDI and subtracting how heavy those material footprints of pollution and resource use and so forth are. And it shows you here, what is the percentage difference between the traditional HDI and a planetary adjusted HDI? And where does it drop countries in terms of their rank? You know, 1 being top HDI, 190 something being the bottom country. And you can see Singapore goes from, you know, having really high HDI, but because it comes at a cost, a material cost, they would drop 92 ranks in that list because of high per capita consumption. Same with Brunei. Malaysia would drop a little bit. Some of our middle income countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam would actually move up a bit because they have decent levels of well-being and they haven't yet had that truly accelerated takeoff of very high per capita consumption. It's starting to happen, but it's not at the levels of Singapore yet. And then you see the negative side here as well, which is the countries that are poor, they may have low material footprints, but they also are not doing particularly well. They don't have a sort of trajectory to move forward, particularly because a lot of these countries have fairly resource-intensive economies. So they may not have high material footprints for the people living in the country, but they're exporting timber, they're exporting fish, and so forth. So there's not a clear sort of path to progress for these countries in red. So it's kind of the countries in green that we want to keep an eye on, which is, can they continue to have higher levels of well-being, but keep consumption down? That's, or keep their material footprint down, have more sustainable consumption? That's really a question that we need to, find the answer to over the next couple of decades. I also want to raise the concern, though, that particularly for the Sustainable Development Goals, we can see in these figures they're not particularly well aligned, they're not integrated. How well are they reflected in what people aspire to in Southeast Asia, either citizens or businesses and so forth? And there was a survey done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, the consulting firm, right when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, and they asked businesses and citizens in Southeast Asia, what do you think are the most important? What are the 5 most important Sustainable Development Goals? What do you think are most useful to you? So you can see citizens are the C's, and businesses are the B's. And so they mapped out all of the, all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So citizen importance, higher citizen importance down here on the x-axis, higher business importance on the y-axis. And a couple of interesting things, like, not surprising, pretty big divergence. Businesses are interested in those economic Sustainable Development Goals. Citizens are interested in more of the well-being focused goals, reducing hunger, having less poverty, better clean water, more education. The only place they potentially came together was around climate action. There was an interest from both businesses seeing it as a business opportunity, but also citizens seeing it as something they were increasingly concerned about. But here's what is worrisome, right? Here's our life on land, here's our terrestrial ecosystems SDGs, here's our oceans SDGs, here's sustainable cities, strong institutions, good governance. These were not ranked particularly highly by either citizens or business. And I would argue that it's those that are truly the most important if we want to have sustainable development. We need strong institutions, good governance, and a biosphere that's healthy. So you can see the headwinds here. We've got disagreement about what sustainable development goals we should focus in on. We've got challenges globally in meeting all of these. And then we've got the really specific problems of Southeast Asia that I've spent the last 2 decades researching. So the question I really ask in this book, having set up all of these problems, is, are the SDGs choosing the right pathway forward? And are they really thinking about better integration of environment and economy, or are they privileging economic solutions at the cost of the biosphere? And particularly for the environmental SDGs, have they been focused too much on market-led, what are so-called neoliberal solutions, thinking about ways to make money off the biosphere at the cost, at the expense of other approaches that might be more efficient and effective? And I'm particularly interested, do human rights-based approaches provide alternative pathways to the sort of export-oriented growth that Southeast Asia has focused in on? And that means thinking about the right to a clean environment as a fundamental human right that would need to be protected by governments. The rights of nature to continue to exist, untrammeled, unpolluted, in a better state than it is now. Could a rights-based approach force us to think a little bit differently about some of those economic choices in Southeast Asia? And I would argue it does. And I'll show you a couple of examples of it. But that's not to say this shift from a focus on sort of economic priorities, particularly for the biosphere, to a more rights-based approach would be easy. It's going to be hard, and it's going to be particularly hard in Southeast Asia. So there's no getting around it. There's no rosy picture here. It's going to be a hard path, but I think we still need to think about how to do it. But what are the challenges in front of us? The first is across nearly every country of Southeast Asia, there are limited legal mechanisms around environmental rights. So here in the United States, for example, we have procedural rights for a lot of environmental policy. That means before the federal or state policymakers do anything, they have public consultations. Not perfect, but it's a mechanism. Most Southeast Asian countries have extremely limited procedural rights around the environment, and almost none of them have substantive rights, that is putting things like a right to clean water, a right to a healthy environment in their constitutions. Those rights-based approaches are increasingly being adopted in other regions. Latin America in particular is a leader on this. Southeast Asia is not doing it, so that's a barrier. We also have, not surprisingly, if you don't have mechanisms, we have low amounts of citizen participation in most environmental policies in Southeast Asia. There's either not a mechanism or people have been more focused on their families, on economic issues, and they've sort of seen environmental things as something to worry about later. You know, when middle class growth has happened, maybe at that point we'll worry about the environment and people will become interested in green space and so forth. So it's kind of put off. Let's focus on the economy first. Not a surprise, weak rule of law and a lot of corruption in a lot of our Southeast Asian countries. There's also been rising inequality, particularly since COVID. So COVID has set a lot of countries in Southeast Asia back in terms of some of their progress in reducing inequalities between high earners and poorer folks, particularly in urban areas. Obviously military rule and a move towards authoritarian leaders in quite a few of our countries. Very siloed ministries dealing with water, lands, energy. They often don't work together, and so you get policies that are focused on one thing and they sort of disregard everybody else. Low technological capacity. One of the problems with the SDGs is they require us to monitor where we are regularly. Southeast Asia does not monitor for a lot of these indicators over time very well. So particularly around ocean monitoring, Southeast Asia is not doing a great job. So we need more of that. We have fairly weak regional cooperation. ASEAN, folks who study ASEAN know, kind of takes a hands-off approach. They've done a little bit around transboundary pollution. That's really the sort of bright spot for collaborative governance on the environment. I would argue another major problem is the lack of recognition for many indigenous communities in Southeast Asia. They are not recognized as having land rights, have been in battles with many of the governments. Southeast Asia is one of the most globally connected, trade-oriented regions of the globe. So many of the products that are produced in Southeast Asia, coffee that we're enjoying, are exported, and so it's really dependent on what's happening with consumers elsewhere, which again makes it difficult to manage environmental policy in the region when it's so connected to consumer demands elsewhere. And then I would say the last one is probably one of my most worrisome focus areas, and that is the shrinking space for civil society in Southeast Asia. Compared to 10 and 15 years ago, environmental NGOs are finding it harder to work, particularly in countries like Vietnam. Several climate activists in Vietnam have been arrested in recent years. A lot of indigenous activists have been under threat and even some killed in the Philippines and Cambodia. And so this is the wrong direction to be going in. We need a vibrant civil society to help manage these many problems. So let's take a deeper dive here. I want to focus just on one of the SDGs for a second. My book talks in specific about The climate SDG, the water, the oceans SDG, and then the terrestrial ecosystems SDG. But I just want to talk about terrestrial ecosystems today. And so this is the SDG 15. This is what we're supposed to be aiming towards, which is protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. So under that, there are a number of indicators that give us a sense, are we doing better on these measures or not? And so an example of this is target 15.1, and that is to conserve and restore terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems as one of the really important elements of this SDG. So by 2020, countries were supposed to have ensured restoration, conservation, and sustainable use of both their land-based, their terrestrial ecosystems, and their freshwater ecosystems, alongside their ecosystem services, with a particular focus on forests and wetlands and mountains. Southeast Asia is not there. I'll show you it in a minute. Another one was to end deforestation and restore degraded forests by 2020. Not there. Another one was to protect biodiversity and natural habitats, in particular halt wildlife trades, and increase the amount of protected areas. We're not there. And particularly in the illegal wildlife trade, try to crack down on poaching and trafficking of protected species. And again, we're not there. So let's drill down just into one of these problems, which is around conservation of ecosystems. So Southeast Asia has extremely rich and varied ecosystems. It's really one of its incredible strengths, is how diverse these ecosystems are, both across mainland and insular Southeast Asia. So this is a map of some of these terrestrial ecosystems. So purple areas are peatlands. You can see those are mainly in insular Southeast Asia, although you get a little bit in sort of lower mainland Southeast Asia. Mangrove forests along the coast are the kind of aqua color. Seagrass meadows, which are very carbon rich, are the sort of light green, lime colored. Terrestrial forests, dark green. And then our agro ecosystems, the sort of brown color. So we've got this rich diversity of ecosystems in Southeast Asia, but a lot of them are under threat, particularly because of agricultural expansion. So deforestation rates in Southeast Asia have been significant over the years. If you follow this, you know. So as part of the book, I pulled together a lot of different statistics from different sources and try to kind of keep it all in one place. And so deforestation over time in Southeast Asia has been pretty significant. There have been various estimations of what it was like in the kind of pre-industrial era, which is the first column here. But the really important thing, I think, is just in the last couple of decades, we've continued to have pretty serious deforestation. So we get a drop, you can see here in 2000, 2020, forests as a percentage of land area are dropping pretty dramatically in a couple of places. Cambodia stands out. Indonesia has lost more than half of its forests since 1700. Burma has dropped significantly. And then this last column here is just in the last couple of years, basically 2020, what's been happening since then. And most countries in Southeast Asia, with just two exceptions, are continuing to see deforestation. And so the exceptions are Vietnam, which is afforesting, and then the Philippines, which is also reforesting some areas, and then Brunei, which is pretty stable. So it basically means, although the percentages don't look high, this is a yearly percentage. So every year, if you lose 1% of your forest within 20 years, 20% or more is gone. And so these numbers are fairly high, even though they may not look that way. So what have been the solutions that have been proposed to these problems of deforestation? Southeast Asia has basically taken a couple of approaches. The first one is to expand protected areas, kind of make little fortresses of protection, and hope that those will be sufficient to reduce pressures on land use change. There have been some measures around agricultural commodities, trying to make sure that they don't encroach upon rich forest areas. So certifying palm oil, certifying timber, certifying shrimp, so that it hasn't contributed to deforestation of mangroves. So this is a mixed bag. So for protected areas, Southeast Asia has a lot of protected areas. You can see on the map, these are just areas under various types of protection. There's a lot of them, but a couple of things stand out. One, they're very fragmented when compared to the ecosystems we just saw a minute ago. And this means that they often are not protecting biodiversity well because they're very small areas, animals can't move, leads to genetic erosion. The other really big problem with protected areas in Southeast Asia is they're not managed particularly well. They are basically paper parks. And again, looking at our countries of Southeast Asia, although some of them have met ambitious goals to increase their protected areas percentage of land area, and that's the middle column here, a lot of these are paper parks. They don't have management effectiveness that's very strong. So you can see Brunei looks great. It's put a lot of land under protection, but there's very little management going on. It's never been sort of rated. And so, again, Vietnam, only 7% of terrestrial land is under some sort of protection, and of that 7%, an even smaller percentage is actually managed well. So this should give us an indication that there's a lot more that needs to be done. Let me give you a couple of bright spots where I do think there's some interesting things going on, and that is not just having formal government designated protected areas that might be these paper parks, but indigenous and community conserved areas. And that's where indigenous communities themselves are granted land rights, and they're able to recognize customary land management approaches, have rights to make decisions about those areas themselves, including excluding exploitative activities. And these are increasing, only in some areas of Southeast Asia, but they are expanding, and they provide a more rights-based approach to conservation. So probably the most well-known in the last few years has been the Salween Peace Park, which was set up by Karen communities in southern Burma. And they have sort of, they have a long history of fighting against the national government, but this was a way to sort of conjoin interest in land rights and independence and political sovereignty all together. This approach, this idea of indigenous and community conserved areas, ICCAs, is spreading in other areas. You can see the Salween area, right, is over here, southern part of Myanmar. But other places, particularly Indonesia and the Philippines, have been recognizing this model, granting indigenous land rights, letting communities decide how best to manage environmental issues themselves. And oftentimes this involves less extractive economic development pathways. So moving away, not bringing in palm oil, but instead focusing more on tourism or other approaches. So you can see mainland Southeast Asia doesn't have a ton outside of Myanmar, so there's reasons to kind of look carefully at what's happening in insular Southeast Asia and maybe hope that there could be better recognition elsewhere. But that's one potential approach that could be something we need to keep our eyes on. I mentioned that one of the concerns with SDG 15 is whether or not it's recognizing this more rights-based approach, as in the case of the indigenous community conserved areas, or are most countries taking a less rights-based approach? Are they more focused on economic pathways to try to meet their SDG goals? And in the book I go into more detail, but I'll just give you the sort of punchline, which is almost all countries of Southeast Asia have adopted some sort of measure to meet SDG 15 that has an economic component to it. And these take different forms. So payments for ecosystem services is one, where you pay people to conserve, usually through buyers of environmental services. So if you get energy from hydropower, you might pay a little bit extra on your water or energy bill, and that would go to conservation. It's a very market-oriented approach. A lot of countries in Southeast Asia have started these. You can see just about the majority, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam all have at least some measures around payments for ecosystem services. They all have started this UN-backed program called Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. So this is a carbon market for forests and potential. And all countries in Southeast Asia have tried to do this. It's sort of stalled, that's a talk in and of itself, but they've used this idea of a carbon market approach as something that they could use to help them meet the SDGs. And you can see on the far column, just about every country has looked at private certification of commodities, whether it's timber or coffee or palm oil or shrimp or fish. There's this interest in getting businesses certified so that their commodities are more, quote, sustainable. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm saying that it's an approach that is kind of a low-hanging fruit because it enrolls business, and it's not always as ambitious as it could be. So palm oil is a great example. Despite decades of certified palm oil, only about 20% of the market is actually considered sustainable. People who know that 20% kind of question how sustainable that 20% even is. So after decades of trying to do this, we still have a lot of palm oil production that is unsustainable. So my point here is that a lot of countries like the idea of trying to use the market to protect the environment because it fits with this mentality of economics first. What about rights-based approaches to the environment? What about this idea that the environment has rights, that people should have rights to a clean environment? Is that widespread? And you can see the answer is kind of the opposite of what I just showed, which is that some countries have recognized indigenous land rights, their ability to set up those ICCAs, but a lot of countries have not. So, and in some cases, there may be a legal recognition, but in practice, it doesn't work very well, which is a great example in Cambodia. Legally, there's indigenous land rights, but they're often displaced by extractive industries. ICCAs, I've said, insular Southeast Asia does have some. Other countries where they could be an interesting approach, like Vietnam, has none whatsoever. And you can see rights of nature. Is there any place in Southeast Asia that's thinking about rights of nature? Indonesia and the Philippines, there's been a little bit of parliamentary interest in this, but it hasn't advanced beyond that. Again, as I said, Latin America has sort of taken a different path here, and that is they have ingrained in some of their constitutions the right to a healthy, clean environment or rights to nature. So Southeast Asia is a little bit short here. So to wrap up, what can we take from all of this information? What do we conclude from all of this? And I'd like to argue that we have a choice. Those of us that are interested in Southeast Asia, that are sort of cheering Southeast Asia and want to see it succeed because of our interactions with the rich environments and cultures and all of our friends and colleagues who are living there, we need to understand that there are other pathways. And I actually am encouraged. I think people are recognizing that the approach to economic development that has been in place is not working. And I think we see that in the increasing number of middle-class citizens in Southeast Asia who are joining campaigns against plastic pollution, which are growing, joining campaigns for urban climate action, which are growing, joining campaigns for small-scale sustainable organic agriculture, which are growing. A lot of this is a recognition that economic pathways that created pollution and deforested have created health impacts for human beings. I think that's the connective tissue which is now becoming very clear, particularly around air pollution, hence an interest in climate action. If we can reduce Southeast Asia's dependency on fossil fuels, we will be able to reduce that particulate pollution. Right now, 75% of the energy in Southeast Asia that is used by consumers is fossil fuels. and so it creates that air pollution. If we were to move towards renewable energy, it would reduce that. So that health link is really crucial. I would argue COVID has also brought to light that health link in terms of deforestation and land use change, right? As we encroach on wild habitats, we may see more zoonotic diseases emerge. So I think those two elements are moving this sentiment more towards this recognition that the pathways that have happened in the past are probably going to need to be rethought. Will it be these rights-based approaches? As I say, they're very incipient, they're very emergent, they're not very far along, but I hope we'll see more. And I think this is a place where we need to keep our eye on for the future. So I'll leave it there. I'll take whatever questions folks have. I hope I've given you some food for thought, more than the actual answers, and I look forward to your questions.